Okay, so we're going to get started today. Good afternoon or morning if you happen to be in my time zone, and welcome. In the spirit of truth and reconciliation, we acknowledge that we are gathered today on the customary and traditional lands of the Indigenous people of our respective territories. Just a few quick notes before we get started today. During our session, our speaker will take questions. If you have questions, anytime throughout the presentation, please type your question into the Q&A box. Please identify yourself, your board, and please ensure that your question is related to the content being delivered and is of a general application rather than with respect to your specific personal circumstance or board. If you have questions that we are unable to address today, please email OPSBA at inquiries@opsba.org after the presentation. So today I'm very happy to welcome back Marion for her third and final session in this governance series. Marion is a leader in corporate learning and development and has extensive experience in board governance and organizational leadership. She was elected as trustee for the Waterloo Catholic District School Board in both 2003 and 2006 elections, serving as the vice chair and chair of the board. She has served on the Board of Governance for St. Jerome's University and is the past chair of the Board of Trustees for the St. Mary's General Hospital in Kitchener. Currently, Marion consults with Ontario school boards on the unique characteristics of governing in the education sector. Again, my pleasure to welcome Marion.
Thank you very much. And it's so nice. I wish I was going to say it's so nice to see everyone again. But unfortunately, you can see me. I just can't see you. But I know from the list, I keep seeing the names that are popping in. There's some old friends there and folks that I've been working with recently. So it is great to be with you again for this last of the series of the Lunch and Learns. We're going to talk about delegations. We want to talk about delegations and how we can hear from the public, but also what we do when in fact there are disruptions. So I want to start out first of all by telling you about a recent experience I had. It was just unusual that this happened at this time. I was actually recently part of a delegation that presented at our regional council on behalf of a community program that I am involved with. And in fact, the group that I'm involved with was one of many delegations who were presenting that day. And as I watched the process, everyone who came was prepared. The counselors asked really, really great questions, and they listened intently to our responses. And it was, for me, an example of how important the process is when it runs well. The problem is it doesn't always run that well. Now, luckily, disruptive meetings are not everywhere, but when they happen, you know how problematic they are. The headlines are filled these days with stories about board meetings where chaos has erupted in the meeting. And the interesting thing is that when you look at those, the chaos that we often identify with delegations coming to our board meetings, it's not always the delegations themselves that are disruptive. I was in another meeting recently that I was actually just observing a school board meeting just to watch the process. And the gallery was full of people who were yelling at trustees, who were very disruptive. But there were no delegations presenting. The people in the gallery were simply responding to the conversation trustees were having and the impending or the vote that was going to be happening. And they were voicing their reactions to that. And so, you know, one of the things that, as those two things have come together for me recently, I began to think through this, that as we begin to take a look at how we can manage delegations effectively, I think that we need to begin to differentiate when there are problems. Where are they coming from? Are they coming from the delegate presenters, or is it coming from those people who are in the gallery, who are simply coming to observe? Because some of the solutions that we're going to have will be very specific to that question. So as usual, though, before I get started, I've got a couple of questions that just to give me a sense of who's here and what your experiences are. So TJ, if we could put up, I've got 3 questions for you today. One of the questions, let me just see if they come up. There we go. First question, has your board had to bring in security to a meeting specifically because you anticipated people in the gallery were going to be disruptive? So you ahead of time had a heads up, you were uncomfortable about what may happen, so you brought in security. So if you could start to fill that in very quickly, I want to see what the experience of this group is. And so TJ, because I can't see the results coming in, you're going to close it at some point and you're going to show me and the rest of us what the results are. How's that? Okay. Wow. Isn't this interesting? About half of us. That and that actually is supporting the evidence that I've been taking a look at. In other words, we talk a lot about disruption, but is it everywhere? No, it's about half. So let's look at the next question, TJ. So here's the second question. Have trustees or members of senior administration had to be escorted safely to their cars following a meeting of the board or committee? So has there been enough threat if there's been disruption? So again, if you could do the same thing. And again, we'll see what happens. Okay, let's take a look. All right, so slightly less, we've got about 44% have, which is 44% higher than we should have. I think that that's the way we need to look at it. When I was a trustee, this would have been 0. And so, you know, we know that that threat is increasing. And I'm going to take you to the third question. So the third question is, has your board needed to recess or move to a private setting because of disruption? Same thing. Just a yes or a no. All right, let's take a look. All right. So again, only about 40% have had to, but not the rest. So this is good grounding for all of us, because it's like those loud voices that we get if parents, for instance, are calling us about bus stops, that sometimes it's the loud voices that make us think everybody dislikes the decisions we made about where the bus stops are, when maybe in fact it isn't. The headlines, if you just follow the headlines, you know, my friends will often say to me, oh my gosh, school boards are in disarray. All of them are having huge problems. And it's not. A lot of you are, but not everybody. So let's start to talk about delegations, and let's talk about, you know, when they work well, and then how we can prevent and minimize some of that disruption. So to begin with, just as there was a very positive experience for me when I went as a delegation, delegations bring tremendous benefits to boards. The Act says, first of all, that meetings of a board and meetings of a committee of the board, including committee of the whole, shall be open to the public, and no person shall be excluded from a meeting that is open to the public except for improper behavior. So we have an obligation, unlike most organizations that are not-for-profit organizations don't have the same obligation that we have in education. Our meetings must be open to the public, except when in fact there are those problematic behaviors. But separate from the Act telling us we have to do this, the reality is communities are made up of a wide range of people, and they have a wide range of viewpoints. And as a single trustee who comes to the table, I cannot possibly know the viewpoints of those people. unless in fact I hear from them. And delegations are one way that we can do that. Those of you who were with me last month will remember I talked about engagement in a much broader way. And I said delegations are one way of engaging those students, parents, and supporters of the board, those groups that we are responsible to. It's one of the ways that we, in a formal way, invite their voices. Having delegations come to a board meeting or coming to a committee meeting is not an exercise in PR. It's not a public relations move. It's not so that they can see that we're doing our work. It's truly an opportunity to understand issues through their eyes. And it's a valuable opportunity that we need to protect. So what do we put in place to make sure that they work? Well, there are what I just call the basics, and much of this, and as I go through your bylaws and your policies, I see that most of you have this in place. It's from, a lot of this is from the Good Governance Guide that you're very familiar with, but we need to begin by assuming that people want to engage with us in a way that is appropriate. That needs to be the assumption of the mindset we bring when we have delegations that come to us. But they still need a framework to operate in. And so, there are things like making sure that delegations address issues that are on the agenda of the meeting in question. You require them to register ahead of time so you know that they're coming and you know what they're going to talk about. You publish expected codes of behavior ahead of time and the consequences of non-compliance. People need to understand the framework within which they're going to operate. Ensuring that the delegation that comes resides within the board's jurisdiction. It's interesting, and I remember when I was a trustee and we were doing accommodation review, having someone who came as a delegation who turned out to not live within our region, in fact, lived quite a far ways away. But her daughter lived in our region and the daughter was uncomfortable presenting. So mom came in her stead. And we had to say to her, we can't accept you as a delegation. The daughter may speak, but you're not a resident of this community. And so, that was an important restriction to put into place. Giving them specific amounts of time. We were told we had 5 minutes. Now you can change that. I'm going to keep referring back to the experience that I had. We were given 5 minutes. And in fact, there were 4 of us from our organization and 2 did the lead presentation, but I was there also as a part of it. And when they were done, we were fairly much done our 5 minutes. And the chair said, well, there's others here. Marion Thomson Howell, you're here. Do you have something to say? And I said, Mr. Chair, I appreciate we've used up our time. I won't speak. And he said, no, it's important. You have some time. So we knew what the time limit was, but he made the decision to extend it. He had the right to do that, but we were very happy to stay within the 5 minutes that we were given. You want to allow some brief time for questions. This is not a time to get into dialogue, but it is a time to get questions of clarification. And then to allow questions among trustees to occur at a separate time. So in our meeting, when the delegations were finished, the public aspect of the meeting ended, they went into meeting and they spoke among themselves about some of the stuff that they had been hearing from the delegation. And of course, allowing a delegation to be made on one topic only once within 12 months. All of that stuff, most of that stuff you've already got in place. But what it does is it gives a framework so people coming to your meeting understand what the rules of engagement are. That's quite appropriate. The other kinds of things is if we assume that they're coming with great intent, and if we assume that they are coming to share important information, there is absolutely nothing wrong with setting the tone by leaving your chair at the table and walking out and greeting them in the gallery when they arrive. It would be a lovely way of having that intimate relationship. And what it does is, again, it sets the tone. The other is that when they are presenting, and I go to a lot of meetings where I do just kind of watch process, When they are presenting, look at them, listen to them, and pay attention to what they were doing. Kind of one last thing, when we were doing our delegation, there was one counselor who clearly was not engaged. She was on her phone. I don't know what she was doing on her phone. She was on her phone the whole time. Finally asked a question of us. It was a very aggressive tone in which she asked it. And we answered it. And then she went on to ignoring everything else that we were talking about. Everybody else set a great feeling for us. It felt like that she had already made up her mind and there was no point in us presenting. So, when you take a look at that, needless to say, they are the basics. And yet, despite those basics, we are seeing increased disruption. And when you take a look at why, it is interesting to see some of the things that are causing it. We are seeing meetings when they are disrupted. They're being disrupted in ways that we've never seen before. And there seem to be some specific issues that are driving that. Some that are drawing the most outburst, most recently, of course, in the past years, were masking and beliefs about the seriousness of COVID. And there was a lot that was going on. There's issues related to DEI and perceived racial discrimination and inequality and all of the supplementary factors that go along with that. Issues related to sexual and gender identity and how they're reflected on an individual level or a systems level. About the books we allow in libraries. When you go through and you take a look at where there's this tremendous negative emotion and this energy coming to our meetings, they seem to be the core reasons why that happens. And when it does happen, the pushback, the anger isn't directed toward our policy. It's directed to you as trustees. It becomes very personal at that point, which is where some of the reason I asked the question about whether in fact you had to be escorted to your vehicles. And the further challenge to this is that the division in these topics isn't just the public against trustees. It's trustees at the table arguing with each other, and the way in which they're engaging with each other has an aggressiveness that is setting the tone for how the public then begins to engage with the board as a whole. So what do we do about that? As I said, I absolutely believe that what we need to do is we need to approach meetings with the belief that these are important to hear and that people are going to come with goodwill. And yet, I think that what we also need to do is to be prepared and to put things into place so that if, in fact, we run into a situation where there is disruption, that we manage it as effectively as we can. Because the reality is, you never walk into a board or committee meeting and get caught off guard or are surprised by the fact this place is full and people are angry. You always know ahead of time that this is a hot topic. And so rather than responding in the moment, what I'd like to do is spend the majority of our time together now talking about what are some of the things we can do prior to a meeting, what can we do during a meeting, and what do we do after a meeting that can help us to be most effective. But before I jump to that, I know there's a couple of questions already in the Q&A. So Stephanie and Catherine, I think you're monitoring that. Is there anything in there that we should talk about at this stage?
Yeah, thanks, Marion. We had a question from Rachel, who's at TDSB, on if you could elaborate how we would structure our meetings so that after delegations, trustees can discuss amongst themselves.
Oh, sure. So there's a couple of ways, and we'll talk about this a little bit when we get into these. But that the fact that the public, what I call the public session of the meeting, ends. And in fact, you know, the chair can say, thank you very much. The public part of this meeting has now ended. I'm going to turn this to trustees, and you can have more often in committee this if the delegation comes to committee. And in fact, we did not present to council. We presented to a committee of council. And so the next item on the agenda was in fact, because remember, delegations come in response to an item on the agenda. So that item may be brought forward, and sometimes it is staff who are going to be presenting something on it, or a committee that's going to be presenting something on it. And then there is discussion among trustees, and it can be reflection on some of the things they've heard. It can be reflection on some of the questions that they would have from the staff report or the committee report, whatever that is. But it's making a very clear distinction by announcing the public part of this meeting. As far as delegations is now over, we're going to turn it over to the meeting where in fact we will turn to discuss this. And I will tell you that I haven't seen it done. I'm not going to say I haven't seen it done well in school boards. I don't want to imply that you're not doing it well, but where I have seen it handled extremely well is at municipal and regional councils. So if you begin to take a look at how they make that transition, it's a very useful way. And so in that case, because it's committee, your committee doesn't have to be as formal a structure as your board meeting in particular, you can have more open conversation. And that's how you would do that. I hope that answers it, and if not, put that question in again.
And then just another question, if you could take a minute to clarify the difference between supporters of the board and supporters of public education.
Okay, so the language that I used, many of you who've been with me before hear me talk about this all of the time. The language that I used is straight out of the Act. And the reason I use that language is because, of course, many trustees get elected, they become trustees on a school board, and they talk about their constituents. And my position always is that you do not have constituents. Once you are elected, your obligation is to the system as a whole, and that the term constituent does not exist in the Act. What the Act says is that you remember that the part of the Act that talks about bringing forth the voices, the language is students, parents, and supporters of the board. And so that's the reason I use that language. So one would have to assume from that language that people who are supporters of the board, because in this case, the word board does not mean you, Board of Trustees. It means the board, as in what I call the system. So the schools, the kids, the learning, the whatever. That supporters of the board are those people who have some type of an interest, vested interest in education. So the language that I use is very specific because it is reflective of what's in the Act.
And then just a final question that's there is, why do you recommend only one delegation on a topic annually? And how are boards supposed to manage multiple requests on the same topic?
So if I'm gonna try to go back to where that is. This comes straight out of Guide from Good Governance. It doesn't mean one delegation. It's in fact, if I am a delegation and I want to come forward because I want to talk about the transportation plan, let's just use that as an example. As a delegation, I can't come to your meeting every month with the same presentation about the delegation plan. So it is not that there can only be Marion talking about the delegation plan in this whole meeting. There might be, as in the situation where I went to council, there were multiple delegations who were all talking about the same issue. It's just that a single delegation can't come forward meeting after meeting after meeting about the same issue. So that line is actually, when I look through boards bylaws, that's pretty common throughout school boards. So that's all it's suggesting is it is preventing someone, I'm going to use me, it's preventing me from coming forward and taking over your meeting agenda month after month after month when you've already heard me one time. All right, so that's what that was referring to. Hope that answers it. Anything else? One last one, Catherine, or do you want me to move ahead?
Yeah, just one more, sorry. So as a
Mhm.
chair, how would you recommend managing trustee questions so that delegations aren't further agitated?
I actually am going to talk about the role of the chair in a few minutes. So let's hold on to that one. And then remind me, Catherine, when we get there and we do another Q&A, if I haven't answered it, we're going to come back to it. How about we do that? Okay, so let's talk about, what I'm talking about, which is the strategies to manage disruptions. And again, we looked at, not all of you are experiencing this yet, but you need to pay attention because this is not uncommon. More and more boards are experiencing it, and you want to be prepared in case it gets to you. And I'll tell you, when I said, the other area, which of course are municipal and regional councils, that never happened to them before, and it's starting to happen to them as well. So let's kind of talk about that, what we can be doing. So I'm going to talk about what we can do before a meeting. Now, first of all, don't go out tisk and look at each of these individuals. What I'm doing is I'm going to give you a whole lot of different ideas, and out of those, I anticipate that you're going to find a couple of them are going to be useful. All right. So it's not as if I'm suggesting you're not doing this already. I'm not suggesting that every one of these is going to work for your board, but I am suggesting that these are the kinds of things you need to take into consideration. So first of all, when you have a hot topic, you know that there's one of those issues where there may be a response. The first thing I would do as chair of the board is I would assemble an ad hoc team to begin to set out plans and set out strategy. Who would be on that ad hoc team? Certainly the chair, the vice chair, the director. If we have legal counsel, and we're anticipating some specific problems that legal counsel may be able to help us with, I would involve legal counsel with it. You're going to hear me through it. I think that when it gets into some of these things, I'm a big believer in getting that legal advice. If it is a remote meeting, I would involve the people who are going to be managing the technology associated with that. But what you're going to be doing is putting a team together to begin to contemplate strategy, to figure out, if there is disruption, how do we handle this? What do we do? When do we turn off the mic? All of what kinds of things are okay, what aren't okay, whatever. But it is always really wise to do that. In addition to that, there's a lot of criticism of boards these days. You are being accused of lack of transparency. So in situations like this, again, it would not be unhelpful to post education materials on your board website ahead of time about whatever the issue is. And what you're doing is you're trying to address concerns that you are ramming through an issue. You're not ramming through an issue, you're providing information ahead of time that may be useful to demonstrate that there's a lot of discernment, there is transparency on this. You're not necessarily going to talk about it in the meeting, but make sure that information is available. You all have a code of conduct that is part of your policies for trustees. I would seriously encourage you to contemplate adopting, or maybe it's amending your current code of conduct, but I would adopt a specific code of conduct that applies to trustees during meetings about the behavior that is expected of them. This starts to address that question about what should the chair do, by the way, and it's ahead of time, but also that addresses those who attend. And I would have in the meeting prior, have a discussion with trustees, reminding them of what the expectations are, because I absolutely guarantee that when trustees become dismissive of each other, or as in the case of the one counselor when we were presenting toward us, or when they become aggressive toward each other, when their tone of voice lacks civility, that sets the tone for people watching the meeting. So I think that that's extremely important. Do not make that the assumption that everybody understands that. In addition to that, review your procedural rules. Just make sure that the procedural rules you already have in place still apply, and you don't have to amend them somehow. And those, as well as the expectations for behavior and the consequences of not behaving that way, I would post with the application form delegations have to complete before they arrive. If you're in a face-to-face meeting, I would have it posted, on the podium that they're going to be speaking at. The chair is going to, prior to delegations presenting, verbally remind people about what those expectations are. The other thing, and most of the time you already do this, but still it's worthwhile in case you don't, when there are delegations, it should be one of the very first items on the agenda. Don't make people sit around and stew and wait in your meeting. It should be the first thing after you approve your agenda. You move immediately into delegations. And then, if it is an in-person meeting, consider how the setup is going to influence the mood of the room and the tone, the level of energy and anger that may emerge in the room. So I know that you have fixed boardrooms, and yet, if in fact you anticipate a group that is going to exceed the allowance of the room you are in, I would seriously consider moving your meeting to a different room. And here's the reason why. This might sound silly, but it's not. If people are crowded into that gallery and they're standing room only, people's energy elevates if they are standing and crowded, as opposed to if they are seated and there is space. You need to think in terms of now how not only the tone of trustees talking to each other influences what people in the gallery are going to experience, but also how the space of it is going to as well. Again, it's going to sound like a very silly example, but it is not. Think in terms of, you ever gone to a concert? And of course, we go in and we sit down in the chair. Where is all the energy in the room? It's in the mosh pit, which is in front of the band. They are standing. They don't have seats in the mosh pit. The mosh pit, they are crowded in and they are standing, because people who set up concerts know that that's where the energy is going to come from. And so you want to think about how the setup of the room is actually going to contribute to potential disruption. So you want to do a lot of planning ahead of time. Then what else? Well, the next thing is, what do you do during a meeting? You may limit the number of people who may actually attend in person, who can actually enter the room. You may limit the number of delegations per meeting. It may mean that you have to hold more meetings, but what you do is you have fewer people within each of those. And again, it's the volume of people that sometimes will create energy. Now, I'm going to make a statement that overrides all of this. We're in a bit of a new territory right now as far as limiting access, particularly because the act says that our meetings are open and we need to allow access. This is, I said to you earlier, and I'm going to keep saying it. I think you need to get legal advice on some of these things as to, can we do this? Can we limit the number of people who come in? Can we only have those presenting in person in the room and others in a room where they are seeing the meeting remotely? Because that's another option. But I would always defer to legal counsel on advice like that. So I'm going to just give you ideas, but what I want you to do is to make sure that they're ones that aren't going to be violating people's rights. Needless to say, and I think I talked about this earlier, you want attendees to sign in and to sign out. Now, why would you do that? You do that because it removes the element of anonymity. So that whole thing about, we know that people will be far more aggressive in an email than they are on the phone, than they are in person, because they're not looking you in the eye. There's an anonymity that goes along with that. If I have to sign my name, first of all, you're ensuring that I'm a member of your community. But, in a sense, people know who I am and they know who my name is. And so there's a responsibility that comes along with that. Needless to say, things like prohibiting noisemakers, signs, all of that stuff goes without saying. But people who are going to come to hold a civil conversation and civil discourse don't come with signs. So they're just not allowed in the room. The other thing is, during meetings, consider if you need to reposition where or when delegates present. I talked earlier, potentially they will present virtually as opposed to in person. There may be circumstances under which that's a better decision. Again, I would ensure through legal counsel that that's okay. The other is, rather than having delegates come to board meetings, we always had delegates come to board meetings. That's just where they came. Begin to consider whether instead they should go to the appropriate committee. So go to a committee member or meeting which is dealing with that issue. So for instance, when we went to council, as I said, we did not present to council, we presented to the committee of council. And so often what will happen is your committee meetings are a little less formal. Often the groups that will come, instead of having, two different topics being presented at a board meeting, you're having one in one committee and one in another. So bringing them to committees will often change the tone as well. The other thing is that in a lot of cases, and in fact, in most cases, I don't know about all of your boards, but in most cases, even though committee meetings are open to the public, they are not broadcast. And so there's also an element of energy and aggression that sometimes comes when people know that meetings are being broadcast. That doesn't happen when it is just simply an in-person meeting. So, I guess part of what I'm trying to get you to think about is how surroundings, how the culture that's within the room is influencing what is happening. And, and again, you may temporarily exclude observers from in-person meetings. And then I do want to talk specifically about the role of the chair. I've talked about this in some other workshops that you've been with me in. So if you've heard this before, just bear with me for just a moment. But I think that in a lot of boards, we don't put enough thought into who will be the best chair for this board, given what we're going to be facing this year. Now, this is timely because I know all of you within, this range of a couple of weeks are selecting a new chair for your boards, or you're revisiting who's going to be chairing. But if you've got some stuff coming down the road, a very, very important role of the chair is going to be selecting someone who has the skills to manage disruption in a calm way, in a fair way, in a way that's not going to escalate what goes on, because the chair is going to be so important. The chair, as I mentioned earlier, is going to have to navigate and manage the behavior of trustees, of the public, of working with the director, with legal counsel, whoever those people are in the ad hoc committee, to figure out what's in the best interest of the public and best interest of children. And you need some wisdom. It is not just because you've been around there the longest that you become the chair. I think that we need to be really selective about those folks. So what are the kinds of things that a chair can do? I absolutely am a big believer that if you can, before a meeting, I think the chair needs to get out of the chair's role and go and talk to people who are in the gallery. You want to develop a conversational tone with people. You want to, at the beginning of that meeting, welcome them. You want to invite them into dialogue. You want to remind them of the expectations that you have of them and what the consequences are, and remind them that you're of your obligation to maintain decorum within the room. But too often we remain separate. And again, if I remain separate and I never approach you, it's too easy for us to be seen as antagonistic toward each other. So I'm a very big believer in having personal contact. Those of you who've invited me into your board to do work with your boards on specific issues know that what's one of the first thing that I do, as soon as you walk in the room, I walk out and I introduce myself to you. I don't wait to do the formal go around the table and have you tell me who you are. I immediately walk up, I shake your hand, I introduce myself, I ask you what your role is, and I do that because I want to build a relationship. And then what else do you do during meetings? Don't be afraid to turn off your microphone and turn to the director or turn to counsel during a meeting for a brief consultation. If you're losing control, if you're unsure of how to proceed, they are there to support you. So don't be afraid to do that. The other thing is that it will be important that you don't allow back and forth dialogue between trustees and delegations. Delegations present, trustees should be allowed to ask questions of clarification, questions to further understand the issue, but not to get into a back and forth dialogue about it. Because often that's when, in fact, an argument will begin or will start. You may choose in a committee to relax your rules a little bit on that, but I would do that when, in fact, the delegation is coming, understanding that this is a dialogue. I would do it then, but I'm talking about if it's really disruptive. The other is to allow security or police, if you have them on site, allow them to judge how to respond to behavior that becomes unmanageable. That shouldn't be the chair who is directing that. Now, remember that ad hoc committee I talked about earlier. The other group that you may involve with that is whoever the head of security is. Because one of the things that I would want to have a conversation about ahead of time is, what are the characteristics of the security people that we want on site? I want people who are on site who are really good at interpersonal relations. I don't want somebody who's on site who's going to meet aggression with aggression. So what is it important to you? And then let them do their jobs. And if they indicate to you that they need you to take a break, you need to follow that guidance. And that's when you would take a recess. In an extreme situation, you would adjourn. And you may move at that point to a virtual meeting. So before I go to what we would do after, let me take a break again. I'm seeing a whole lot of stuff in Q&A. So Catherine, let's go back to questions.
Yeah, there's some great questions that have popped up while you've been presenting. And you covered the one that we were going to move over about how chairs handle it, and going more into questions just specifically for clarification. So our first question for right now is, given that many boards require advance notice for delegations, how can we assure the public knows what topics will be coming up in order to request their delegation ahead of time?
Okay, that's interesting. So one of the ways of doing that is, of course, you're going to be you're going to be posting your agenda. And what you could do is you could post a draft agenda earlier. I mean, so, if, for instance, I know as chair that in my December meeting, we're going to be talking about some issue that I know may be a hot issue, then we can put a notice on the board or on the website ahead of time. We could post a draft agenda through committees. That information is going to be coming out. So I think that there's a number of different venues that we can be posting. So for instance, I'm going to go back to our experience. We knew that the committee was because we asked. We said, we would like to come and talk about X. When are you going to be dealing with it? And they told us it's going to be in the, I don't know, what month was it? October meeting or November meeting. and it's going to be at this committee. So we said, thank you very much. And so we registered to be a delegation. So they'll be asking as well.
Thank you. And so we spoke earlier about multiple delegations on topics per year.
Mhm.
However, what if the agenda item previously delegated has had significant new public information brought forward within the 12-month period? Would it be wiser to allow an updated delegation rather than restricting them to the specific 12-month window?
Well, again, your board can decide that. If my objective is that we give a fair hearing, I would say yes. Just as the chair in our committee said, Marion, I'm going to give you extra time because I think that it's important. I think that you can. However, it would be clear that what they're coming back with is not the same presentation they gave before. So in other words, it is a presentation taking into consideration the new information that we've gathered, because that's what we're seeking input on. So that's, again, why you want to register ahead of time. And the other thing about the registering ahead of time, there's forms that people have to fill out. I know that this is going to be more labor intensive, so just bear with me. But if I was chairing a board and I was a director, because I know there's some of you who are with us today, and I knew that this was going to be a hot topic, and I knew that there's a lot of anxiety in the community about it, and I had I might even have the senior team take all of these applications that have come in and give people a quick call and say, hey, see, you're going to be coming in. We just want to, make sure that there aren't any questions that we can handle ahead of time. Is there anything that we can do that will help you understand the issue further? And you're going to find that some of those delegations with that, first of all, change their tone. And second, in some cases, are going to say, you know what? You've answered my questions. Thank you very much. I'm not going to come as a delegation. I know it's more work, but you have to decide where your energy goes. Does your energy go in up front to help offset it? Or is your energy going to go into that horrible meeting and try to manage it then and the after effects? So I would do some of those things.
Great. Do you recommend asking clarification questions or questions to get delegations when it seems that nobody else is? So example, someone presents and everyone just kind of sits there without questions, of asking just that softball to show interest and that the entire board's paying attention.
You could. Again, I'm just going to keep going back because it was such a recent experience for me. The chair of the committee, as he introduced the delegations, said, I want you to understand that your presentations may be clear enough that we really aren't going to have any questions because you've given us all the information. So if there are no questions, please do not feel insulted. It's because you did a really good job at presenting. And I love the way he positioned it. And so, in fact, there were some delegations that didn't get any questions, and that was okay, because they all walked away believing that they had presented so clearly that it wasn't needed. So, you can judge. You can judge.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great way to handle a situation like that.
Yeah, he did say, as I said, it's a fluke. It is a fluke that I happened to have that experience as we were getting ready. But I began to kind of process, thinking, wow, what is it about this that people are doing really well? He did an excellent job, excellent job.
If a delegation goes to committee, should they also be permitted to present usually the same information at a board meeting?
No, I would suggest they go to committee. I would make it clear that that's where we handle delegations. I would change it. We handle delegations at committee, unless there is no committee dealing with an issue. So I would have them do committee.
And then our final question, can only people who reside in your community be allowed to attend public board meetings? And the second piece to that, when requiring attendees to sign into a meeting, can we and should we require identification?
So anyone can attend a meeting. I mean, anybody should be allowed to attend a meeting. I mean, if you think online, in fact, you folks don't know this, but I often will go into watching your board meetings, and I don't live in your community. So, I mean, you just can't control that. So anyone can attend. It's a question of can they become actively engaged in that by being a delegation, and that's when it is restricted. There was a period a number of years ago now. I was facilitating it was a committee of the whole for a local municipality where they were trying to get local input. It happened to be on an issue related to the library. And it wasn't so much delegations as they were allowing the public to come in and ask questions of an advisory committee and the committee of council. And one of the ways that we handled it was, rather than, because what happens with these meetings, this is another, I never thought about this. Another thing that happens with meetings like this is if you have a microphone, people are often, they so much want to get to the microphone that they just line up. And there's this long lineup, and the energy goes into standing in line and getting my place in line. And so instead, what we did was everyone who was going to present had to sign in, and we had them sit, and we told them, you will be called on in this order. Please remain seated until you are called. And so we kept them in their seats. And in order to keep the meeting moving quickly, it's funny, I forgot about this. One of the things that we would do is I would say, okay, Stephanie Donaldson, you're up. And I would say, TJ Gertz, you're on deck. And I would have that person standing in the back. TJ came up next, and I'd call who was next on deck. But as a result, people all knew that they were going to get a voice, but they could stay where they were, which allowed them to listen to the conversation as opposed to putting their energy to getting into line. I kind of forgot about that. Any more?
Just the second part on that, if we should be requiring ID.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you ask that part? I forgot. What was it again?
No, that's okay. So if we have attendees signing in for meetings, should we require identification?
Only if, in fact, they're going to be a delegation. They have to attest to the fact that they reside in that community, but not if they're coming in. Okay, let me move to the very last. And then what I did do is I did allow a lot of time in this one because I knew that this was going to be quite an issue. So we've talked about some of the things that we can do before. We've talked about some things that we can do during. And again, I'm going to say it one last time. I think that some of these, particularly when we move people out of the room, when we restrict them to virtual input, when we have things that are perceived as limiting, I just caution you to seek legal counsel to make sure that they are things that we're not going to get ourselves into trouble for, because it's new territory for us, and we just don't want to get ourselves into situations that are problematic. So what do we do after the meeting? I mean, you know this, but we should actively debrief. Use that situation. I always talk about use that situation as a case study. So, when did we find out? What did we do in response? How did we prepare? What happened during the meeting? What was our response during the meeting? What worked? What didn't work? What will we change the next time? We should use every one of these as a learning opportunity so that we refine the process and we refine our skills. It's one of those things that, in my experience, the majority of boards don't do that piece very well. And so what we do is that the next time we repeat some things that weren't as effective. The other is any questions that couldn't be handled during the meeting, things that come in virtually, just as you've offered for people, later on you'll get back to them, respond to them. And again, I know that this is one of those where you're going to be rolling your eyes and saying to me, Marion, we don't have the staff and the resources to do this. But in many situations, the more that we can approach people personally, the more we're going to establish relationships. And then, of course, just communicate next steps. Let people know, what are you doing with that information? When is the decision going to be made? One of the other reasons that I recommend that you have delegations in committee is because if you have it in board, they often don't have time to think about that information well enough prior to making a decision. But if it goes to committee first, they do. And so let people know what next steps are. So there, you know, I hope that what this does is it gives you some kind of sense of how we can begin to deal with really what is relatively new problematic behavior that we're seeing, and get back to those productive meetings that we can have with the public where we really benefit from their input. So with that, let me just stop again because I knew that there was going to be questions. What else do have people been asking, Catherine?
There's just a quick question on if delegation should be restricted to the topics on the agenda.
That's the reason that they would usually come, that it is a topic that is on the agenda, or you know, it's going to be something that is dealt with for decision in the next meeting, but it is something that is imminent. Now, you know, there may very well be times that I don't know. I mean, you might consider it a committee that there is something that somebody from the public says, here is something that you've never ever thought about. I think you should, and your committee is intrigued and wants to know about it. But that's, I can't even imagine that's an anomaly. It should be something that is being dealt with now. And it is the same as I have said when we did, when I've worked with staff and I've talked about the reports staff bring to the board. I have said to them that the only reason to bring a report to the board is to help them in their decision-making. Well, that's what delegation should be doing, is helping you in your decision-making. They should be helping you by bringing perspective.
And I think we're good to move forward.
All right. Well, I want to thank you. I know that this is your lunch hour. It's 12:59. So I've been watching the clock. You have 1 minute left for your lunch. I hope it's been worthwhile. And I hope that this series of 3 have made you think and have been worthwhile for you as well. So I'll turn it over to you folks, Catherine.
Yeah, thank you, Marion. It has been a wonderful 3 sessions that you provided with us. Really interesting, informative. I know I've enjoyed them. I can't speak for everybody. I've heard great things from everyone that I've talked to. A reminder to the group that our next PD opportunity is the Public Education Symposium, which takes place January 25th through the 26th in Toronto. Registration is open via the OPSBA website. And again, thank you for all those that joined us today, staff at OPSBA, and especially to Marion. Thank you. Enjoy your day.